About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
Well, this is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness studies, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. In the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is defined as being awake and aware, knowing what's going on around us. In the field of noetics, though, consciousness is much more. It's the processes and products of mind, both in our awareness and outside of it. It's those profound human experiences that shape our lives. And ultimately, consciousness is what connects all of us. So far in this series, we've looked at a number of models of what consciousness is. We started with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung's ideas from the early 20th century, explaining how much of what goes on in the mind is not in our normal awareness. It is, in fact, unconscious. And then Charles Tart's 1960s descriptions of the various states of consciousness, and Julian Jaynes relating consciousness to the separation of right and left hemispheres of our brain. We looked at some of the field models of mind that have been developed by Rupert Sheldrake, Kurt Levine, and others, trying to explain how it is that what goes on in the mind affects and is affected by the body and other things, faster than nerve signals can travel. Which brought up how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness, as described in the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami, among others. We then looked at the global brain, or noosphere, as described by Peter Russell, Teilhard de Chardin, and Ervin Laszlo, and the field of transpersonal psychology, which applies some of these ideas and understandings in therapy and research. We went on to look at the work of Bruce Lipton and Candace Pert, who described how hormones act as molecules of emotion and lead to a biology based on our belief. And related to that is what is increasingly called coherence, a state of consciousness in which heart, mind, and emotions are all functioning in alignment on various measures. We've explored some of the experimental results supporting these new ideas about consciousness, including for telepathic communication between two people, experiments involving mind over matter, and the experience of what is called clairvoyance, or remote viewing. And then we talked about the different states of consciousness we operate in every single day. And recently, we focused on frequencies and how we can adjust the vibratory pattern of our brain waves, raising our frequencies and lowering them, using the work of Penny Pierce and others. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. Click on the little cloud up on the banner at the top of the screen. And on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mention on the show. Now, last week, I shared the story of a journey to health that I experienced some years ago. This week, I thought we'd talk about how and why that happened. Let's start with someone who had a similar set of experiences in patterns and belief.
Let's jump into the science of how minds and bodies interact. So, how exactly are trauma and disease correlated? I want to mention to you that trauma doesn't have to be a near-fatal car accident. It doesn't have to be coming back from war. Really, in my mind, the way I view trauma is if you view the world one way and then some situation happened to you and now you view the world in a different way, that can be a traumatic circumstance. So it doesn't have to be this overwhelming experience. Have you ever heard the phrase, stress kills? So I used to hear that phrase and I used to scoff. Yet now I see just how valid that statement is. Physical and psychological stressors cause inflammation to occur in the body. Inflammation is the key word in many diseases. Reducing inflammation is the key to healing many diseases. When events happen in life, they're recorded. When stressful events happen, they are recorded as is. And that creates a certain level of shock on the mind, which therefore sends distress signals down the nervous system, which in turn will tell the endocrine system to increase adrenaline and cortisol. And while those levels are increased, our immune levels are lowered. The fact that we have these stress responses initially is not a bad thing. Yet the fact that our minds compound all of these situations over time without ever letting them go, every situation builds upon each other. So the real reason we experience stress in reality is for our own good, for our own safety. If you think of an animal, for example, a mouse. A mouse sees a cat, gets anxiety, has stress levels. Why? Because it needs to make the decision to run away. Yet once the mouse runs away, once the mouse finds cover, that anxiety is gone. The mouse doesn't overanalyze what the cat was thinking, how to feel about it now, and what to do about it. No. That's only something humans do. Humans encounter a stressful situation, we instantaneously attach meaning to it, and then it's recorded forever. So the initial stress isn't bad. The continual attachment to the stress is bad. So just to reiterate, when we experience stress, there's a recording in the subconscious mind, and enough of those recordings over time will cause havoc and an overstressed nervous system, which in turn will cause an overproduction of stress hormones and a suppression of immune function. So now the golden question, how do we reverse all of this? So there's a new study dedicated to all of this called Psychoneuroimmunology. Psychoneuroimmunology meaning the branch of medicine that deals with the influence of emotional states and nervous system activity on immune function, especially in relation to disease.
So Donna has been telling us that she had horrible symptoms, including trauma and lots of pain, and she found that there was a connection between the experiences she had had and what was going on in her body. And she found that she could change her state of consciousness, which would then change the way her mind was working, which would then result in a very different state of body. So let's look more at that term she mentioned, psychoneuroimmunology.
Hey y'all, it's Ryan, and today I wanted to give you an overview of psychoneuroimmunology and emphasize the kinds of really cool questions that you can ask in this field. You can think of psychoneuroimmunology as a branch of health psychology where we're often interested in linking psychological phenomena with the biological mechanisms that lead to differing health outcomes, so differences in mortality rates or disease susceptibility. These studies can inform organizational leaders, public policy, public health campaigns, and become the foundation for important interventions across many different domains. There have been questions around the mind-body connection really for thousands of years, but the field of psychoneuroimmunology itself is much newer, since about the 1970s. But I want to tell you briefly about one important finding from this field that I think about a lot. But before adaptive immunity, where our body has some memory of how to defend against a pathogen, we also have a non-specific immune response, which is mediated by pro-inflammatory cytokines. So take, for example, when you have an infection, you get a fever, you feel fatigued, you have aches, numbness, and a reduced appetite, right? You probably want to stay in bed and not engage socially as well. So these are some examples of the kinds of symptoms that occur when you have that first non-specific immune response, which again is the body's general response to the message that, hey, something is not right here. We might not know what yet, but there may be an invader. So pro-inflammatory cytokines are a critical part of this response, and there's good evidence that they actually cause this response. So a logical next question then is, how do we know that cytokines may cause this non-specific illness response? Well, when you inject mice with a toxin, which reliably causes them to produce pro-inflammatory cytokines, mice develop these same symptoms. Conversely, if you then inject mice with a cytokine antagonist, which just means that it disrupts the production of cytokines, then that response will reduce or stop. So importantly, this sickness behavior response is adaptive. So think about it as being this appropriate response to an infection, similar to how fear is an appropriate response to a predator. The only problems come when we start to have a sickness response when there isn't an infection or a predator to defend against. If you're like me, this might be like the symptoms of depression, right? That's because there's massive overlap in how our immune systems respond when infected with a pathogen and when dealing with clinical depression. So Dr. Dancer investigates how sustained peripheral immune responses, that is inflammation, can lead to clinical depression, and also begin to explain why people with chronic inflammatory conditions like cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes so often experience comorbid clinical depression. So these are some of the kinds of questions we ask in psychoneuroimmunology and that you can ask too.
So what we have, based on what these two people have been telling us, is a whole new science called Psychoneuroimmunology. It's not new. It's as old as everything else we've been talking about here in the field of Noetics since the 70s, that is making progress in developing understandings about the links between our emotional state, our experiences, and the condition of our body in any given moment. We begin to find out that the body really does know how to heal itself, and this field has helped us understand it. I'll let someone else explain that, too.
What I found is that the brain communicates with all the cells in the body via hormones and neurotransmitters. So, for example, if you have a negative thought, belief, or feeling in the brain, your brain triggers this as a threat. Something's wrong. If you feel lonely or pessimistic, things are bad at work, you're in a toxic relationship, the amygdala says, threat, threat, threat. And it turns on the hypothalamus that talks to the pituitary gland, that communicates with the adrenal gland, and the adrenal gland starts spitting out stress hormones like cortisol, norepinephrine, epinephrine. It turns on what Walter Cannon at Harvard called the stress response, that triggers the the sympathetic nervous system, and puts you into that fight or flight mode, which is adaptive, it's protective if you're running away from a mountain lion, But in everyday life, you're supposed to have that quick stress response if there's a threat, and then it's supposed to switch right off. This isn't what happens in our regular lives these days. But fortunately, there's a counterbalancing relaxation response that Herbert Benson at Harvard described. And when this comes about, the stress response turns off, the parasympathetic nervous system turns on, and healing hormones like oxytocin, dopamine, nitric oxide, endorphins fill the body and bathe every cell in the body. What I found the most amazing about this is that those natural self-repair mechanisms that we all have, they only flip on when the nervous system is relaxed. So when you're having stress responses, all those natural self-repair mechanisms get flipped off. The body's too busy trying to fight or flee in order to heal itself. So when you think about this, you have to start to wonder, how can I possibly start to change the balance in my own body? Now, the relaxation response is what researchers think explains the placebo effect. So when you're going to get supposedly maybe a new wonder drug, you don't know whether you're getting the placebo or not, it triggers that relaxation response. That combination of the mind's positive belief and the nurturing care of a healthcare provider relaxes the nervous system. And then all those natural self-repair mechanisms can come into play.
All those natural healing responses in the body can come into play. That is such an important concept. So whether we're talking about chronic stress, whether we're talking about chronic inflammation, whether we're talking about a trauma, the same process occurs. As the body can relax and enter into a different state of consciousness, then the hormones and the other activities that have caused continued stress responses stop. And they are replaced by other hormones and other processes, which then are supportive of the natural healing processes of the body. And this, I believe, is a large part of what happened when I was trying to get over my life-threatening illness and managed to do so. Another piece of it had to do with what I was seeing and telling my body about who I am. But that's another story that we will talk about at another time. All right, it's time for us to talk about a book. And the book I'm going to pick up on is Related. Surprise, surprise. It's called Consciousness and Healing, Integral Approaches to Mind-Body Medicine. One of the authors is Marilyn Schlitz. Tina Amaruk and Mark McCosey are her co-authors, and they're actually editors because there are articles by many, I think on the order of 50 different researchers in this book explaining the relationship between mind and body and how a medical approach can include that relationship. The book is divided into several sections, each of which has several articles written by these interesting researchers. In the table of contents, we find that there are several sections. Part 1 is defining integral medicine. Part 2 is mapping the healing system. In mind-body medicine for Section 1 of Part 2, new perspectives on the body in Section 2, revisioning illness in Section 3, honoring the spectrum of life in Section 4, and then in Part 3 of the book, healing, a move toward wholeness. Section 1, psychology's movement toward wholeness. Section 2, spirituality, religion, and healing. And Section 3, essential capacities. Part 4, honoring multiple ways of knowing. Epistemological pluralism is Section 1. Section 2, integrating the wisdom of the world's healing systems. And then in Part 5, envisioning a new story for health and healing. Transformations of medicine in Section 1. Sociopolitical transformation of integral medicine, Section 2. And then in Section 3, healthy earth, healthy human, and Section 4, social healing. What I'd like to look at now, since we've been talking about psychoneuroimmunology, is the psychosomatic network, current findings. And the text says, since the 1980s, psychoneuroimmunology and its allied health fields, e.g., neuroimmunomodulation, psychomolecular endocrinology, behavioral medicine, have continued to produce findings that dismantle previously erected barriers between biological subsystems, bringing mental and emotional processes into the healing equation by showing bidirectional relationships with intimate components. Research on neuropeptides is informational substances continues to substantiate and elaborate the construct of an integrative psychosomatic network. Now, you may have been told at some point that some symptoms you were exhibiting were psychosomatic. What they were trying to tell you was you were being sort of like a hypochondriac. You had an emotional issue that was showing up in your body, and if you changed the emotional issue, you wouldn't have any issues in the body, which was quite accurate, but it didn't address the fact that there is a relationship between emotional issues in the body, and it didn't address how to fix it. So Psychosomatic, in the technical term, is simply saying you cannot separate the mind and body. And they go on talking about specific peptides, and they say things like, such findings have radically altered the landscape of basic immunology research, which as recently as 10 years ago, this was written or published in 2005, as recently as 10 years ago embraced the idea that the immune system was regulated only by immune substances, cytokines, etc. It is now clear that many immune cell products also are produced by nerve cells, and that nerve cell products are pivotal regulators of immunity. It keeps going. Importantly, the drifting roles of immune and nerve cells occur conspicuously when our bodies are challenged by pathogens and other foreign entities. So that's just one little tiny piece of this remarkable piece of work, a paperback, and it has a CD as well that I think is an audiobook of the contents. And the publisher is Elsevier. It was published in 2005. Marilyn Schlitz, Tina Amarak, and Mark S. Mikosi, Consciousness and Healing. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments on KXCR, 90.7 on the FM dial in the Florence, Oregon area, and streaming on KXCR.net. And that sound tells me we need to look at what's going on in the world today and what you, the listeners, are curious about. And what's going on in the world today just came out on my internet news feeds from a website called The Daily Beast. And the title is The Science Behind Why People See Ghosts and Demons. The author is Sophia Quaglia. Does it take a specific type of brain to experience paranormal anomalies? Some scientists think so, but it can go two ways. There's a series of explanations about what parapsychology is and that it's considered an academic branch of psychology studied in universities and research facilities, and that scientists in this field believe more academic, experimental, theoretical, and analytical research will show that what science knows about the nature of the universe is incomplete. And several people are quoted that reinforce that. And then she says, yet critics argue that parapsychology procedures and methods aren't in line with rigorous scientific standards, the results are flimsy, etc. Many of the experiments aren't replicable, which cuts at the core of how science is validated. And there's one big issue that persists. There are no valid theories to support most of the findings. Of course, this happens across all scientific disciplines, one of her sources notes, but skeptics disagree. And a number of psychologists say we need the field of parapsychology because if all those things existed, telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, etc., then science has to be radically rewritten. And another scholar in the Netherlands says that there are fundamental cognitive differences between those who experience the paranormal and those who don't. Surprise, surprise. Not everyone can see this or feel this or know this. So he did point out, we identified that paranormal believers had a stronger self-attribution bias, where in a random card guessing game, they more often took credit for positive outcomes when they were, in fact, by chance. His name is Michiel van Elk at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He also said these findings fit with the broader view that paranormal believers are prone to a range of cognitive biases. But at the same time, these biases may well be adaptive for fostering mental health and self-esteem. A woman at the University of Hertfordshire in the UK, Charlotte Dean, said that there was a strong link between belief in paranormal phenomena and cognitive function. Most of the findings suggest that paranormal activity is linked to specific cognitive traits. Quote, believers are typically characterized by an intuitive thinking style. That's kind of a gut feeling. And they'll go with that to try and explain something that they otherwise can't explain. Whereas people who are skeptical of the paranormal tend to be more analytical. They will go through every different way of solving a problem before they come to a conclusion. Parapsychologists tend to agree to a certain extent that there are certain cognitive abilities and tendencies among those who are able to experience paranormal events that aren't present in those who are not. Paragraph down, a proclivity to paranormal experiences is distributed among the population. There is a concept of transliminality, which is a thin boundary structure between the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and the environment. And they're seeing that that is a strong predictor of experiences of what might be called hauntings. Quote, there is some evidence that people who have more paranormal experiences have more communication between the hemispheres of the brain, for example, and more potential for crosstalk. There's more permeability between areas of the mind and between other people and the environment, and potentially paranormal information. So this is a fascinating piece to come out on my news feeds, coming from a kind of a fun website, The Daily Beast. The link will be on our website, noeticmoments.org, if you'd like to follow it up. And there are hyperlinks in the article if you want to follow up on the specific papers. We know that in certain states of consciousness, it is not possible to experience any of the things that people find can happen in the laboratory when they are studying noetic processes. And we also know that there are certain states of consciousness in which these things happen consistently. The question is, what state of consciousness are we in? Perhaps some people are able to shift from one state of a consciousness to another more readily, or perhaps our culture is training people to stay in one state of consciousness and not allow that communication between the hemispheres of the brain that is increased when we are in other states of consciousness. That, to me, is fascinating, and I hope it is to you as well. Well, that's it for today's show. That brings us to the end. The next time we get together, we'll look at more of the research that's being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience life differently when we know how to use it fully. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's always a list of titles and other resources that we refer to on each show, and where you can also send me comments and questions, and I will do my best to get them answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.